When it comes to historical memes about France, the surrender meme is probably at the top of the most famous. Now, we can talk about whether that's warranted another time, but it might be more interesting to ask, why did France surrender in the Second World War? Potentially, this has become such an internet sensation, I say that as if it happened recently, because in 1940 it came as such a shock as compared to the First World War, when from 1914 to 1918, the French, together with their allies, the British and the Belgians on the Western Front, had stuck it out and for 4 years had fought on despite losing huge amounts of manpower, resources, and indeed territory to the invading Germans. It was on the basis of a similar war being fought that the French government in the 1930s invested in a very heavily fortified area around their borders with Germany. This would become known as the Maginot Line. Further south, they would also create an Alpine Line, thinking that a similar war of attrition might be fought and to make it impossible for the Germans to invade. However, when the Germans would invade, it would similarly, as actually the First World War, not go through those well-defended areas of the French border, but rather go through Belgium. This time, different to the First World War, also going through the Netherlands, particularly through the area of Belgium, the Ardennes, which the French believed would be impassable, thus catching the Allies severely off guard. They also used other elements such as attack from the air and the deployment of paratroopers to really catch the enemy off guard. And after several weeks of fighting, it was clear that the French were in a terrible position. German panzer units using new tactics known as the Blitzkrieg were able to go far further behind French lines than had been thought and force the French to retreat. The British as well, and what was left of the British Expeditionary Force would retreat from Dunkirk after almost being encircled and destroyed there. It was clear at this point, with German troops herring down towards Paris, that the war really was already over for the French. However, there were several ideas in the French government about what they should do at this point. It seemed that mainland France was indeed lost, but several voices in the French government thought that they should retreat to the large French colonial possessions in North Africa and continue the fight from there, bringing as many troops and resources, and crucially the navy, which was largely still intact, with it to continue fighting. While there, they could draw on the considerable resources of the French colonial empire in particularly Africa and Asia for its substantial manpower as well as resources in order to, with the British, continue fighting against the Germans and the Italians. Others in the French government favoured a more direct approach, a union with the United Kingdom, an Anglo-French union that could together continue resisting. This would be a huge conglomerate of the world's two largest empires joining together and hopefully being able to retake France at some point from dual locations in North Africa and indeed in Britain. On the 16th of June, even some legislation was being prepared to this end for a declaration of union between the two, which the British hoped would allow the French Prime Minister, who was broadly in favour of the plan, of convincing the French government to join this union and thus to continue the fight against the Axis. It read, France and Great Britain should no longer be two nations, but one Franco-British Union. The constitution of the Union will provide for joint organs of defence, foreign, financial and economic policies. Every citizen of France will enjoy immediately citizenship of Great Britain. Every British subject will become a citizen of France. Who knows how Henry V would have felt about all this. But in the end, the French government turned down this proposal in favour of surrendering to the Germans. Now, there were several points in favour, 3 key points that the French government hoped that they could achieve by entering into negotiation with the Germans rather than simply going over and continuing the fight from North Africa or joining into a union with the British. These were, number 1, the ability to maintain control over at least part of metropolitan France. Number 2 was the maintenance of the French fleet. And number 3 was maintaining the French colonial possessions around the globe. As it happens, the Germans in their negotiations were not against the French keeping all three of these, at least in part, and with many provisos. And so the French government decided that entering into negotiation and indeed signing an armistice with the Germans was the best thing that they could have done, and so that is exactly what they did. It's also true that at this point, very many Frenchmen had been taken prisoner by the Germans in their attacks. At this point, some 2 million Frenchmen were prisoners of war to the Germans, and this was quite an effective bargaining chip for the Germans to use, as well as the fact that at this stage, what was left of the French army and indeed their military equipment was in no real situation to really offer any solid resistance against the Germans, who had completely overrun the north of the country, which resulted in the creation of what became known as Vichy France. This was the centre and south of France as a semi-independent entity, while the north and the western seaboard of France would come under direct German occupation. Note as well that Vichy France proper would maintain control of French Algeria, while French Tunisia and French Morocco would be protectorates of Vichy France. Given that this is quite a large area indeed of North Africa and of France itself, a more pertinent question may be to ask, why did the Germans allow the French to maintain control when they could easily have taken over the rest of France, as we've just mentioned? Well, as it turned out, many of those French three reasons that they wanted to enter into negotiations were also important to the Germans, but for slightly different reasons. One of those is that the Germans, of course, would need many men in order to garrison and to maintain order in the parts of France that they had actually captured. If they were to capture the rest of France as well, then that would mean that they would need many more troops that could have been employed elsewhere, particularly in their operation to try and take Britain, or in their preparations for further pushes in Eastern Europe against the Soviets. By having the southern part of France being maintained by French troops, French police, French administrators, and French resources, it freed up men and resources for attention elsewhere. The Germans, as mentioned, had also taken many French prisoners, which they could then use in labour, particularly in construction and mining, but also in German agriculture, which was severely undermanned at this point because so many German men were off fighting in the military. They could also pressure this southern French state, which really would be hard-pressed to say no against its powerful German neighbour, in order to send more workers and then use these prisoners, these French prisoners that they had in captivity, as bargaining chips for releasing a few of those prisoners in order to get more workers or more resources and other favours from this southern region. At the same time, they could also rely on this southern area to police the south of France, hunting down communists, resistance fighters, and indeed Jews, with the creation of the milice, a kind of militia, as well as allowing them a small army that would be used to defend against any Allied attacks on French soil. Again, this freed up men for the Germans that they could use on other fronts and for other tasks, while these southern Frenchmen would do their dirty work for them. Another key point in the Germans accepting a French state to the south was the French Navy, which was really powerful in the Second World War and sometimes doesn't get the credit and indeed the potential that perhaps it should be recognised. Another factor in why the Germans may have wanted to create a Vichy French state to the south was the French Navy, which had been largely undamaged by the German invasion given the places where they were in port. Now, the French Navy was very large. Even this is before the outbreak of war in January 1939. They had 5 battleships, a battle cruiser, 18 cruisers, several carriers, 58 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 76 submarines, and several smaller vessels too, making it one of the largest navies in the world at that time, and indeed one of the most modern. Now, if the Germans had continued to occupy the rest of France and there had been no armistice between the French government that the French Navy, of course, was adhering to their commands, then it's very likely that the French Navy may well have gone over and joined the Allies elsewhere, particularly the British. Indeed, some French ships actually did this anyway, but their official orders were to remain in port until these negotiations were finished. These ships then, together with the British, would seriously have altered the balance in the battles such as the Battle of the Atlantic and indeed other marine combat with the Germans on the high seas. Instead, with Vichy France officially being a neutral country, although really under the thumb of the Axis, it meant that the French Navy would remain in port and not be involved in the war. This being part of the armistice that they signed, they wouldn't be taken over by the Germans or the Italians. Even though both sides actively planned to do so at some point, they would remain out of the war. Now, the British were very worried, nevertheless, thinking that the Germans and the Italians would actually try and take over the French Navy and use it against them. This is why, shortly after the negotiations at the French Algerian port of Mers el-Kébir, the British would attack the French fleet, sinking and damaging several ships and killing over 1,000 French sailors in their attack to try and stop these ships falling into the hands of the Italians and the Germans. In a similar vein, the French colonial empire was also at stake. By having an official negotiation or armistice with the French government, it meant that all of the French colonies also became part of the Axis area of control and would fight against Allied attempts to take them over. Perhaps most crucially for the war, these were the French colonial possessions in the northwest of Africa, French Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, as well as French West Africa. If the French had not signed an armistice with the Germans and these territories had continued to fight against the Axis, then perhaps the Second World War in North Africa would have been very different, where the Italians and the Germans had a safe western flank being controlled by the Vichy French. Instead, they would have had a war on two fronts immediately, fighting the British in Egypt, as well as these then free French continuing French forces fighting against them in the West, and so likely a different scenario in the first place. So quite interesting to consider. And as mentioned at the time, the Germans really could not afford to be diverting forces here to be fighting both against a continuing French resistance in French Northwest Africa, as well as the British in North Africa, later the Americans also, when they were preparing everything for their attacks on mainland Britain in Operation Sea Lion and the Battle of Britain. Indeed, the French colonial empire is larger than just Africa, as you can see from this map. They also had several holdings in Asia, which actually were mainly occupied by Japan and Thailand in 1940 and 1941. But indeed, if all these territories had remained on the Allied side and the Allies didn't have to fight campaigns against them to take them over, Allied forces and resources and logistics could have been used against fighting the Germans and the Italians rather than against the Vichy French, thus freeing up those resources and making it a more difficult job for the Axis to fight in the theatres where they were already fighting. Instead, they had to commit these men and resources and slowly, from 1940 to 1943, take them back, and indeed with the help of the Free French, apart from in Asia where the Japanese kind of ripped up the whole Axis rule book and said, okay, we're going to take over anyway. The German Navy would have had a very difficult time in subduing the very disparate and far-flung French colonies when they already had their hands full fighting the British in the Atlantic. So sidelining the French Navy and indeed keeping the French colonial empire on side was also a big help to the German Navy. And so for all of these reasons, it made sense for the Germans to take over the north of France, but to keep a semblance of an official French government in the south, Vichy France, which meant that they had access to their colonial empire, that the French Navy remained out of the war, and they didn't have to spend so many resources on occupying and manning the south of France. However, that would all change on the 12th of November 1942, when the Germans officially rolled up Vichy France and occupied it anyway. This was because of the changing nature of the war, particularly in northwestern Africa, those Vichy French colonies, where the Americans, together with British help, would launch Operation Torch, where American forces landed in many of these Vichy French areas, The Americans indeed thought if they would land as American troops that the French would welcome them as liberators, these Vichy French colonies. However, they fired on them with machine guns, and these areas all had to be captured, many of them with Free French support, so those Frenchmen that did not believe in the armistice and would continue to fight on the Allied side, although in the end, the Vichy French did fight against the Allies in North Africa. However, following the success of this campaign and the threat of an invasion from North Africa across the Mediterranean, the Germans occupied the rest of France, also booting out the small area that had been taken over by the Italians in their 1940 invasion when Italy changed sides in 1944. So that is why the Germans didn't take over all of France in the Second World War. It's something I always found quite curious, indeed when looking at maps of occupied Europe, and why there were these two French states that had existed, and why didn't the Germans just take over everything if they'd so successfully trumped the French in the Battle of France. But having done the research for this video, it does appear to me to make sense why they did it, in terms of the global picture, in terms of their resource and manpower distribution, which they were of course already preparing to be sending so much of to the Eastern Front for their fight against the Soviets, then indeed it does make sense why they allowed Vichy France to continue as an entity, which did actually remain pretty loyal to the Germans, as we saw with Operation Torch in North Africa. And indeed in not really revolting against the Germans at any point. So anyway, let me know if you found this interesting, if you already knew about Vichy France, and if you had anything to add. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. Oh yeah, some people get annoyed when I say I have been Hilbert. I mean, technically I have only ever been Hilbert. I am Hilbert. I will be Hilbert. So I don't know why the perfective tense of that is irritating, but you can explain that in the comments below. In any case, I am Hilbert, and I will see you in the next one. And this was The History.